Welcome, everyone. My name is Sheila Jellin, and I am the director of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Kentucky. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Lukens Lecture. This lecture grows out of the Mark and Ruth Lukens International Prize in Jewish Thought and Culture for the best paper written by a graduate student working in the field of Jewish studies. Essays each year are submitted from across the globe for this contest, and it has been a great joy for the committee to see what up-and-coming scholars are working on. Lukens winners have gone on to become leaders in the field of Jewish studies, so we are lucky to be able to get a sneak preview of the unfolding field as we solicit, read, and recognize these essays year after year. Before I introduce this year's winner, I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Mark Lukens. Dr. Lukens studied secular topics in public school and Jewish topics from Torah to Talmud after school in Hebrew school. Secular education helped pave the way for him out of poverty and into social mobility, while Jewish education helped keep him rooted in Judaism. Dr. Lukens taught pharmacology and toxicology for 25 years at the University of Kentucky. During that time and into retirement, he continued to study Jewish topics, and the Lukens Prize honors that commitment to Jewish learning. This year's winner for her essay Capturing Corpses, the Advent of Photography and Depicting Jewish Death, which is also the title of the lecture we will hear today, is Ranana Dine. Ms. Dine is a PhD candidate in religious ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Her dissertation is titled My Eyes Grow Dim from Grief, a Jewish Visual Ethics of Death and Memory, and focuses on how a visual approach to the corpse and to the memory of loved ones can inform our understanding of our obligations to the dead. She is the research coordinator at the University of Chicago's McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics and the managing editor of Images, a journal of Jewish art and culture. Her scholarship has been published in the Journal of Jewish Ethics, the British Medical Journal, Medical Humanities, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. She holds a bachelor's degree in religion and art from Williams College and received her MPhil from the University of Cambridge in theology and medical humanities. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Ranana Dine. Oh, and by the way, as Ranana talks, you can put any comments or questions into the Q&A spot at the bottom of your screen, and after the talk, I'll facilitate some Q&A from there.
All right. Good evening. So before I get started, I really want to take the time and thank Professor Sheila Jellin and the Lukens Prize Committee at the University of Kentucky for inviting me to speak tonight. It is truly an honor. This paper has gone through several iterations, and I want to thank the many people who have read the work, given me feedback, and improved the presentation you're about to hear. Finally, thank you to all of you who are in attendance for coming out on a Tuesday evening to learn about photography, Jewish history, and death with me. Without further ado. In 1866, Rabbi Judah Azod, a leading figure of the Hungarian Orthodox rabbinate, died, leaving his followers bereft. During his life, Azod, who was known as a great halakhicist and opponent to educational and religious reform, forbade the creation of any representation of his portrait in any media. But upon his death, his followers were so distraught at his passing that they desired that an image be made of him to keep for posterity. The rabbis at Azod's funeral agreed with his followers, and Azod was quickly dressed in Sabbath clothes, propped up in his chair, and a large book was placed in his hands. Then a photograph was snapped. Yep. And this is indeed that photograph, apparently, which was quickly copied and sold to admirers with a tacked-on laudatory inscription. Some sources state that the profits from the sale of the photograph were enough to marry off his daughters. This is all despite Azod's own opposition to the creation of a portrait of him and the fact that traditionally in Judaism, one is not supposed to benefit from the body after death. And indeed, stories began to circulate that those who had instigated the creation of the post-mortem photograph died within the following year as punishment for their Nevul Hamet, desecration of the dead. Richard Cohen, a Jewish art historian who has written about this episode, explains how this story reveals how devotion to a particular figure carried to an extreme could override halachic regulations. Although halacha, Jewish law, is relevant to Rabbi Ajod's story, in this paper I want to explore something beyond issues of halacha and the idolization of rabbis. Rabbi Ajod's portrait can help us investigate the relationship between the technology of photography, the dead body, and the meaning of a good or bad death. Photography and death have had a significant relation ever since the invention of the technology in the mid-19th century. Post-mortem photography was used to construct the good death for Christians in the Victorian era and served as a tool for memory. Within Jewish history, however, photography of the dead has mostly meant to signify Jewish suffering. Although there's no halachic ban on images or photography of dead bodies, there are relatively few depictions of corpses in the Jewish cultural tradition. In some cases, the act of photographing the Jewish dead body itself has been a form of violence, working to construct the Jewish bad death. Although death photography serves a purpose, it can inform the viewer of something significant and even incite moral outrage and action, we should ask what story these photographs construct. Photography of Jewish corpses often tell a narrow story of a bad death, or even create that bad death itself. We should consider turning to other images of Jewish death that can tell a more complete story of relationality, community, and care in the face of death. I want to now lay out a roadmap for this talk so that we all know where we are heading. Before we can delve into the materials on Jewish history, we will need to spend some time both in the land of photographic history and theory and with Christian death rituals, so please do bear with me. After seeing how photography participated in American Christian deaths in the early years of its invention, we will compare that to Jewish ambivalence towards visualizing death. We will then arrive at a discussion of how photography narrates Jewish tragedies, pogroms, the Holocaust, and COVID. We will spend a bit more time thinking about theory before leaving off with considering how we ought to be visualizing Jewish death and what kinds of photographs a more relational and caring imagery requires. I want now to think about the qualities of photography as a particular technology that operates in history, a 19th century innovation that allowed for the immediate capturing of images and their reproduction. Here, I am using the theory developed by Amos Morris-Reich in his new book, Photography in Jewish History, 5 20th Century Cases. Morris-Reich, building on the work of the theorist Wilhelm Flusser, argues that photography exists within reality. It partakes in and is a component of the history it documents so that they necessarily affect each other. Many scholars, maybe particularly historians, see photography as something that illustrates history, that records it and provides evidence. Morris-Reich wants to argue that photography does more. It actively creates the history that it is part of and creates a new way of seeing. The advent of photography, he writes, created a new form of evidence and a new form of imagination. Photography, particularly as a technology of reproduction, alters those who come into contact with it. We all see hundreds of photographs every day. One can only speculate about how social media in the last 20 years adds to this discourse, making photos a key component of our reality. Photographs do not simply document the physical world, but in addition, quote, continually and dynamically altered the relations between the world and reality. Particularly illustrative of Morris Reich's argument, perhaps, is the example of photographic portraits for passports. When photographs became required as a form of identification for international travel, the necessary portrait, quote, introduced new objects, redefined the passport as evidence, altered the category of identification, and reshaped the notion of the authentication of identity. One can consider how passport photography participated in the strengthening of borders, the advent of modern immigration policy, and the creation of the image of the modern citizen. Susan Sontag, an influential theorist of photography we will return to later, provides another example when she cites how photographs were first used by the Paris police in the roundup of the communards in June 1871, changing the nature of surveillance and becoming a tool for the modern nation-state to control expanding and more mobile populations. With these insights about photography's participation in history, we can ask, how does photography contribute to our understanding of death, the corpse, and what it means to die well? Rachel Harris, in her book Photography and Death, explains that photography was always linked to the dead body because the camera has the unique ability to capture a moment not as we would like it to be, but as it was. Therefore, she argues, quote, the camera has been called the perfect medium for engaging with death and the authentic death scene. Although this statement requires nuancing, we all know that photographs can be edited, manipulated, and faked, and indeed many of death scenes have been faked historically. The camera does have a unique relationship to the dead body. In its ability to record the physical body of someone who was once living, a body whose life force has left it, it captures something that a painting or a drawing lacks. The dead body was present. It is a record of what it means to no longer be living. Photographs of the dead participate in how we narrate and understand death, and what it means to die, and help create our modern conceptions of the dead body. When commercial photography first appeared, it had one particularly popular use in the United States. Itinerant photographers and photographic studios advertised their ability to photograph the recently deceased. In the first 40 years or so after the advent of photography, so roughly 1840 to 1880, professional photographers advertised in the nation's newspapers that they would capture the likeness of deceased persons and that they were prepared to take pictures of a deceased person on 1 hour's notice. Photographic trade journals discussed matter-of-factly the best strategies for taking photographs of corpses. Although J. Ruby, in Secure the Shadow, Photography and Death in America, argues that the tradition of photographing recently deceased loved ones did not disappear after the Victorian era, and indeed is ongoing, the popularity of these kinds of images and the public discussion of them has waned. These images, however, contribute importantly to the history of the notion of the good death, and indeed photography's later ability to depict the bad death would change the American understanding of death forever. The concept of a good death was particularly powerful in 19th century Protestant America, where for American evangelicals, the manner and condition of an individual's death provided necessary evidence as to whether that person had been saved. Evangelicals used death objects, including photographs of the dead, to materially experience the necessary piety for salvation and generate the material memories and emotions necessary to experience the presence of the dead loved one in heaven. Images of the recently deceased often took on a romantic aesthetic in order to distract the viewer from the inevitability of bodily decay and instead allow for the imagining of reunion in the afterlife. Many of the images of deceased loved ones from this period indulge in an aesthetic ideal of death as the last sleep. This last sleep image was created through the use of light and shade, the positioning of the body and clothing, and occasionally the inclusion of props to give the illusion of a peaceful pious slumber. These images all contribute to the notion of a good Christian death, in which the deceased awaited the day of resurrection and their heavenly ascension. The images were meant as a tool for focused mourning, representing a physical link to the dead. In 1843, in England, the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote to Mary Russell Mitford, describing the power of the memorial photograph. It is not merely the likeness which is precious, but the association and the sense of nearness involved in the thing, the fact of the very shadow of the person lying there fixed forever. I would rather have such a memorial of one ideally loved than the noblest artist's work ever produced. The recent invention of photography contributed to the creation of the Christian good death in 19th century America and England. The ability to have a photograph of the deceased from the moment of their death allowed for death imagery to become a significant tool of pious mourning and memory. The ability of photography to help shape the good death would be disrupted by the American Civil War, however, and the new technology's ability to document the aftermath of the war's bloody battles. The images taken by Alexander Gardner and his assistants of the corpse-strewn battlefield at Gettysburg would haunt the public and introduce them to the ways photography can narrate the bad death. Today, war photography, as well as photographs of mass shootings and other violent deaths, serves to create an aesthetic of bad deaths. Photography's historic beginnings as a tool to construct the image of the Christian good death shows the breadth of the work photography can do in history. It can be a tool of piety and mourning or a record of violence. Both options are open to the camera when it is faced with a corpse. Turning to modern Judaism, the possibility of photography working to create the good death appears absent. Recalling the story of Rabbi Ajod, there is some discomfort with creating images of the body per se, and particularly after death. Although images and photographs of living people are present in Judaism, and there's no explicit ban on images of corpses, photographs of dead bodies created as tools for mourning or for memory are rare. One interesting pre-photography case of a depiction of a Jewish corpse is that of a series of paintings commissioned by the Prague Chevra Kadisha Burial Society in the late 18th century, which depict the rites of caring for the dead body. Even paintings like these are rare, and Judaism lacks the iconography of the dead body present in Roman Catholicism, Buddhism, and other faiths. Thus, a photograph of a Jewish dead body lacks the pious resonance that, for example, the Victorian images of the beloved dead contain. Judaism is known for its aesthetically simple funerals and efficient burying practices, which contrasted it starkly with those taking place in American Christian society at the end of the 19th century. Alan Amanek, in his book Dust to Dust, A History of Jewish Death and Burial in New York, quotes an 1895 New York Tribune article narrating how Christian New Yorkers saw the Jewish burials taking place on the Lower East Side. Gentile viewers, looking into an undertaker's shop, are puzzled and even disgusted by the plain, unpainted coffins with no lining that the Jews used to bury their dead. The carpenter explains that the Jews might buy better, but they believe that it is right to have the coffin plain and to have a poor funeral. Even in Israeli photojournalism today, coverage of death events is impacted by the Jewish custom of covering up a corpse and not displaying it openly in public. Jewish discomfort with visual imagery of corpses can be seen in a tragic example from the aftermath of October 7th. There's a photograph going around on social media of Zakah search and rescue volunteers with body bags. What is notable is that somewhere in this photograph cyber travels, someone visually blurred the bags. The image never included direct visual access to the corpses, And even so, someone felt a need to blur the bags themselves. The impulse to obscure this image, one that is not graphic or does not depict a corpse itself, is worthy of noting and considering further. So how does photography participate in the creation of our conception of Jewish death? It is my contention that the act of photographing a Jewish corpse is part of the construction of the bad Jewish death. This is due in large part to the violent history of Judaism since the advent of photography in the mid-19th century. Photography was thus used to narrate and broadcast atrocities occurring to Jews around the world, and was key to the reporting of Eastern European pogroms, the Holocaust, and terrorism and war in the Israeli-Arab conflict. Photographs printed in newspapers brought the violated Jewish dead body into the living rooms of millions around the world. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, pogroms and anti-Jewish violence occurring in Romania, Galicia, and the Russian Empire received an immense amount of newspaper coverage. Indeed, Sam Johnson, in his book Pogroms, Peasants, and Jews, has argued that the newspaper coverage, quote, added up to a potent mixture of harrowing detail, moral outrage, and more than a hint of sensationalism. The 1903 Kishinev pogrom, which is the one pictured here, surpassed the previous pogroms of the 1880s in the immensity of the violence and the numbers killed, and was also photographed in a new way. Advances in both printing and photographic technology meant that the shockingly graphic images of mass murder were distributed to news agency networks worldwide. These images might have been some of the first to record the violated Jewish corpse for a public audience, shaping how the world would conceive of modern violence perpetrated against Jews. As is well known, these photographs would hardly be the last. There is a vast literature on the Holocaust and photography that I do not have time to delve into here. The dissemination of the photographs of the Nazi death camps shocked the world and spurred much ethical questioning and reflection. These include questioning the whole moral enterprise of photography altogether. Here, I will just quote Susan Sontag's reaction to the images. They were only photographs of an event I had scarcely heard of and could do nothing to affect, of suffering I could hardly imagine and could do nothing to relieve. When I looked at those photographs, something broke. Some limit had been reached, and not only that of horror. I felt irrevocably grieved, wounded, but a part of my feelings started to tighten. Something went dead, something is still crying. Once one has seen such images, one has started down the road of seeing more and more. Images transfix, images anesthetize. Photographs of the Holocaust risk overwhelming the senses and risk overwhelming the construction of the Jewish death entirely. These images, which were taken without the consent of the victims, run the risk of shooting the victim twice. Some scholars, such as Susan Crane, have argued that indeed these images should not be looked at all. I want now to turn to a more contemporary example about which there is so far little scholarship. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a fair bit of photojournalistic reporting about COVID's toll in Jewish neighborhoods in both the US and in Israel. In particular, on February 17, 2021, the New York Times published a photo essay focusing on COVID's impact on the Haredi Jews of Mea Shearim, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, titled "How Many Funerals Will Come Out of This One?" Notably, the photographer Dan Belletti, in an article reflecting on the creation of the photo essay, explained that he had limited access to the community, and so, quote, "What you see in these photographs is striking, but it doesn't tell us everything about what life was like inside those homes." The images in the article include pictures of volunteers with the organization Chasdei Amram caring for the ill in their homes. A major focus of the article was the tension between Haredi communities and the Israeli state's COVID regulations, and how some of the Haredi community have at times flaunted the restrictions. The article also included several images of Haredi funerals and Haredi corpses covered in body bags. If the clinical anonymous photographs of the body bags were not enough to make it clear that these COVID deaths were bad deaths, the article's text made it obvious that this was not how Jews are supposed to die and be cared for in death. Usually, the burial society, the Chaver Kadisha, after preparing and clothing the body, loosens the shroud to allow relatives to confirm the identity of the body. But the pandemic has altered even this holy process. Due to the infectious nature of COVID, the bodies are sprayed with disinfectant and sealed in transparent nylon fabric before being taken to the funeral. Wrapped underneath the nylon, the shrouds cannot be loosened before the burial. To identify the deceased, relatives must instead rely on photographs taken by the society's members during the cleansing process. The photographs of the body bags tell the viewer that something is wrong with this death. And indeed, photography signifies the undesirableness of this death. COVID cadavers are photographed for identification rather than being identified through traditional means. One photograph from the essay struck me in particular. It is a photograph of young Haredi men holding onto and carrying the bier of a recently deceased COVID victim. The light in the photograph is dramatic. The light is focused to illuminate the talit, prayer shawl, that covers the body, as well as the faces of 4 of the young men surrounding the bier. The expressions on their faces are ones of concentration and alarm. The photograph complements the article's opening video, where black-suited and hatted men desperately reach out, jostling one another for the talit-covered body of a deceased rabbi. Both recall to me a painting by Samuel Herzenberg titled The Black Banner from 1905. In the painting, Jewish men dressed in black coats and hats, the same garb as the Haredim in the COVID photographs, are in a procession carrying a black coffin to its final resting place. There is a book open on the coffin rather than the talit-covered body in the photo, and the hands of the men reach out in desperation for the book. Norman Kleeblatt, an art historian, has argued that the black banner covering the coffin and the painting's title are Hirzenberg's attempt to demean the Black Hundreds, the anti-Semitic units responsible for the pogroms of 1905 and 1906. The Black Hundreds newspaper was called the Russian Banner, and the money given to them by the Tsarist regime was called black money. Inside the coffin may be a victim of the pogroms. For me, the iconographic connections between the COVID photo and this painting of the aftermath of the pogroms links us back to the bad death of modern Jewish history. Although death from COVID is a death from disease and not violence, it is iconographically the same. It is the image of a bad death. It is worth taking a moment here to think about the ways photography and death are always intertwined. 2 of the most influential theorists of photography, Susan Sontag, mentioned above, and Roland Barthes, explore photography's links to death and mortality. Both articulate the way that photographs of people signify the inevitable death of the subject. First, Sontag points out that photographs are tokens of absence. We take and look at photographs to help relive and remember places, people, and events. Photographs in this way are a tool of memory. They are tokens of what has been present but is no longer with us. For Sontag, all photographs of people are symbols of mortality, memento mori for the inevitability of death. She writes, photographs state the innocence, the vulnerability of lives heading toward their own destruction, and this link between photography and death haunts all photographs of people. Sontag sees the shadow of the corpse in all photographs of people, even when they are alive. Photography as a record of a person at a particular instant, a particular moment of their life, reminds the viewer that the moment is over and that death inevitably approaches. In this way, all photographs of the living are in some ways photographs of the dead. Flipping around Sontag's ordering of the photographs signifying death, Roland Barthes argues in his classic book, Camera Lucida, that photographs can be a resurrection of the image's subject. Readers of Camera Lucida argue that as much as the work is a meditation on photography, it is really a meditation on death, with particularly the second part of the book dedicated to Barthes' reflections on photographs of his late mother. At the beginning of the text, Barthes comments that every photograph is a return of the dead, a chance for the image's subject to be revived in the mind of the viewer. Barthes illustrates this idea through the discovery of a photograph of his mother as a child, a photograph he dubs the Winter Garden photograph. He describes the picture, which he does not show the reader, as containing, quote, a treasure of rays which emanated from my mother as a child, from her hair, her skin, her dress, her gaze, on that day. His mother returns almost literally for Barthes. The rays that emanate from her photograph penetrate him, the viewer. For Barthes, the photograph contains a shadow or a trace of the physical being that is the image's subject. Photography thus always participates in the depiction of death, whether that is prefiguring mortality for Sontag or reviving the dead for Barthes. But the examples I brought above from Jewish history do something distinct in that they actively create the idea of Jewish death as bad, violent, and tragic. And it is this bad death narrative that is the story of Jewish death that is often told in the media and history textbooks. As Dara Horn has pointed out, the thousands of Holocaust books and movies and TV shows and lectures and courses and museums and mandatory school curricula have made it clear that dead Jews, and especially Jews who died badly, are, quote, the most popular of all. But also, the act of taking a photograph of a dead Jew can transform their death into a bad one, even if it was otherwise a death from natural causes. The photographs of Jewish COVID deaths in some ways display this transformation, as does the story of the photograph of Rabbi Judah Azad, with which I open this paper. Azad died at age 69 or 70, as far as I'm aware, from natural causes. The act of photographing his body was a desecration of his death and changed his legacy indelibly. For example, I know the story of his photograph and not any of his halachic works. Photography participates in history. It constructs the stories we tell, how we perceive events, how we interpret the world around us. Photography has an ethics. It participates in our normative commitments and how we see the good, the bad, and the ugly. As Susan Sontag writes, in teaching us a new visual code, photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have a right to observe. They are a grammar and, even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. When we look at death images, this ethics of seeing becomes even more significant. Death photographs construct our notions of what it means to die well, and we should be asking what these photographs are trying to show us. Who created the image? Who is the subject? Is it a good death or a bad death, and why? Would the subject want their death depicted, narrated by another, beyond their control? I don't mean to say that death images are always morally wrong. Sometimes they give us crucial information, can spur moral action, or serve as an important token of memory. But particularly with Jewish death images, I wonder if they can ever construct a good Jewish death, or do they always participate in a story of Jewish history as woebegone or violent? In the case of Rabbi Ajod or even the COVID images, It is the camera itself that is violent. What do these images tell us? Can they ever tell us the full story of a Jewish death, and along with it, the full life that was lived by the corpse we now see? And tragically, these questions have only become more urgent in the wake of October 7th and the use of photography as well as video to record, narrate, and horrify after that brutal massacre. To conclude, I want to return to one image from the COVID-19 photo essay. In it, a Haredi man in his long black coat and hat stands in the center of the image, facing a wall of death announcements. These announcements are ubiquitous in Orthodox neighborhoods in Israel and in some Orthodox enclaves in the diaspora. They are always just text announcing the name of a person who has died, and often include some information on the funeral and the phrase Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is the true judge, which is said by religious Jews upon hearing news of a death. The New York Times text accompanying the photograph just says, the posters outside highlighted the human cost of all of this. But I think we can see something deeper here. These kinds of simple death announcements that can be found at all times, not just during a pandemic, imply a community of tight-knit relationships. The announcements presume that people in the community know these individuals, will care that they have passed. They might even want to attend the funeral or Shiva. The black and white text posters on walls of Jerusalem stone are a particular aesthetic of Jewish death, but are also an aesthetic of relationality. Although the New York Times, by including this image within their COVID story, make these posters into part of the construction of a bad Jewish death, to me, this image tells a story of a different kind of death, one that includes family and community and care. What would it mean to use images like this one to construct a picture of Jewish death and dying? What story would we be telling then? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ranana. That was just as wonderful as it was when I first read, an early version of it, even better than that original version. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to encourage, we have a nice, healthy group of people listening. I want to encourage people to drop questions into the Q&A. And while you're preparing yourselves to do that or doing that, I will begin. I have a couple of questions that I will ask to start us off. So first of all, I want to tell a story about this really interesting experience that I had when I went to Yad Vashem a few years ago. They had in the opening gallery, I guess, a video that they were playing, and it was a shocking video because it captured in motion a very famous photograph of that Vishniac had taken. So Roman Vishniac, for those of you who don't know who he is, was a Jewish Russian photographer who published a book called A Vanished World in the 1980s. But before that, he had published a book called Polish Jews in 1947. He had escaped Europe during the Holocaust, and but he had taken a series of photographs of East European Jews in the late 1930s on commission. And after the war, he displayed those photographs and published those photographs and saw them as again as a testament or evidence of a world that was lost or destroyed. So I was in the midst of writing a book in which I had a chapter on Roman Vishniac, and I was very well familiar with his corpus of photographs, no pun intended, and I knew this photograph very well. It was of a little boy in a cheder studying Torah. And then when I walked into Yad Vashem, I saw a movie that was taken simultaneously with this series of photographs that was on display, and you could see all these little boys who have become frozen in time and are icons of East European Jewish life that was destroyed before the war. Suddenly they've come to life. So my first question to you is the relationship between photographs and videos within this conceptualization that you have of photographs and history and anything really, but especially Jewish death. So that's my first question to you. My second question is, I wanted to go back to the question of Holocaust photographs, which you brought up briefly in the course of your talk. And I wanted to talk for a minute about the controversy that arose around the Sonderkommando photographs that were taken at Auschwitz in August 1944, when the Hungarians had come to Auschwitz, and the Germans they were killing so many at one time that they couldn't incinerate the bodies fast enough. So they dug pits and burned them in pits. And the Sonderkommando, which was still agitating, trying to foment a rebellion and send proof to the outside world of what was going on at Auschwitz, took a series of photographs that they did sneak out. And those photographs were the only existing photographs of the inner workings of the crematorium at Auschwitz. And so the question that you raised of the ethics of displaying these intense photographs of bad Jewish death, right? I wanted you to say a little bit more about what happens if the photographs are the only evidence, right? And there was this whole controversy around this very question in the French press when the photographs were put on display at an exhibit in France. So those are my two opening questions. It looks like we have a few other questions in the Q&A. So I'll let you answer mine, and then we'll go to the rest of the questions.
Yeah, so very thought-provoking questions. On the topic of video, I will say I'm not a video expert. So I think there's a whole world of film studies that thinks about the kind of technology video is, that I do not feel nearly as expert in as I do with photography and other kinds of still visual media. I think video takes us to another plane. Video also can tell a more didactic story, right? You can use it to tell a narrative that won't have sort of time jumps in it the way a series of photographs will. So it leaves a little bit less room for the imagination, and so it could in certain ways be harder to work with than the photographs, right? This last photograph that I think is still up on the screens, right? You can, there's so many death announcements. You can say it's terrible, or you can have the interpretation I tried to bring. Well, there's something going on here that shows the kind of density of relationships. And actually, if you look at the image in detail, a lot of the death announcements are of the same people. So it's actually not quite as many as it seems like. You have to be able to read the Hebrew and whatever to notice that. So I think, sometimes video leaves less room for these kinds of multiple interpretations, but I do want to leave room for the video experts to step in there. On the Holocaust photograph example you bring, I think the example of that kind of photograph where it was really meant as evidence of an ongoing atrocity, that's where as I say, death photos can really do important moral work. They can be evidence, they can outrage, etc. I think one question I would ask is, now that the Holocaust is history, is decades over, what do we do with those photographs now? Who should see them? What do they do for us, right? They can be an important historic object, an important image for historians. I'm not sure that they should be publicly visible, as the depiction of Jewish death. And I also just think we need alternatives, right? The Holocaust photographs are always going to be there, and they're always going to be part of how we narrate the story of that genocide. But we could use some photographs of Jewish death that aren't about tragedy and genocide and terror, but are about the ways that Jews care for one another in death. So when those photographs will always have an important role. I think we should ask questions about when and where they ought to be seen and by whom. But we also just need to develop robust alternatives that tell a different story alongside that really important one.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions. Max Bamberger says, amazing, and then asks, how do you understand other symbols of the dead in Judaism, such as the yahrzeit candle or the yahrzeit plaque?
Yeah, read the final chapter of my dissertation when it gets written. I think one thing about that is that those are visual objects for memory, right? They're about remembering usually like a dead loved one rather than a depiction of a corpse, which I think is sort of my focus here. I think there's really interesting things going on in how we use visual objects to instantiate our obligations to remember the dead, and where I think there's a much richer visual culture, such as yahrzeit candles, memorial plaques, yahrzeit books, photographs of dead loved ones from when they were alive, that really work to create a world of memory that is extremely significant for modern day Jews. So I think that like memory is a little bit of a different situation than sort of dead bodies, where I really think there's not a lot of visual culture, and where I think the depiction of them, it does something important when it appears and is worth investigating when it appears, because it's so unusual and is usually trying to tell us something is important and going on there.
Great. There's a question by Richard Dine, who I imagine is someone you know, who says, excellent presentation. One can imagine pictures of a bad death spurring ethical action to try to prevent or limit whatever bad acts are causing the death. Could you imagine a picture of a good death spurring some good action from the viewers?
And I think, so if we're, again, still focused on sort of dead bodies, I mean, here, I'm doing a lot of work right now with these images from Prague, which aren't photography, they're paintings. They're earlier than, let's see if they're earlier than the invention of photography, but I think these are paintings that depict the process that bodies go through from the deathbed to burial, and I think that they are doing something really interesting in 1780s Prague, which is an interesting time in Jewish Prague, to depict the ways that the members of the Chevra Kadisha and the larger community are obligated in caring for the dead, and how that's sort of a fully communal act, and how death is part of everyday life. So I think, for example, I don't think this exists, but there could be images of dead bodies that are used by the Chevra Kadisha to teach how to take care of dead bodies. I am once again interested in images of care. So, and again, who are the ones caring for dead bodies when? Should those images be seen and by whom? I think is a live question. But I can also imagine, again, a robust visual culture that depicts Jewish death as one involving the kind of relationality and care. I kind of like that being, the posters and things, rather than these kind of vulnerable dead bodies that don't have a say in their photograph. But again, I think there's a way to tell a story about death that could prompt people to partake in the rituals and care for dead bodies that is really crucial and is considered the highest chesed, chesed shel emet, the kindness that can't be repaid. So I definitely think there are images that could participate in that and that kind of kindness.
Okay, so there's a question from Elliot Dine, who says that Elliot has a question from Lauren. The theorists you discussed focused on the power of pictures of individuals and the bodies themselves to prefigure the person's death or resurrect them. But the photos of Jewish death mostly showed bodies in bags or coffins with the identity obscured. Does that affect how these theories apply?
Oh, that's a really, really fascinating question. I mean, I think I would answer yes, right? I think the photos I at least shared really can't kind of participate in the story of their death, right? For Roland Barthes, the pictures of his mother allow him to kind of be in relationship with her after her death. And again, I think that Jews definitely do use photographs of dead loved ones from when they were alive to participate in kind of obligations of memory. I think the kinds of photos I included here don't do that. I also made a decision not to include very graphic images. So there are definitely images of Jewish death where you would be able to see faces and body parts that I chose to leave out of this presentation. But oftentimes they're anonymous. I mean, there's some really amazing stories about Holocaust photography where Holocaust survivors looked at the photographs and recognized themselves or recognized loved ones and were able to bring back sort of the names of the individuals in those photographs and kind of take up the autonomy for those images. And that would be another place where I think that is important moral work of trying to figure out who these people were and tell their stories. But most of the images that I included here don't give us that option. And so are always going to be limited in our ability to think about what these people's lives were like, when they were living.
Okay, so we have a question posted by Natalie Pulitzer, my colleague at the University of Louisville in the Jewish Studies program there. She says, at the end of your talk, you suggest that the collective function of photographs of the bad Jewish death actually show collective caring. What about the difference between the good Christian photos as individual deaths, individuals who have relationships with those who commission them? Bad Jewish death photos are collective rather than individual. Their collectivity, as far as the Jewish emic connection with them is concerned, makes them by default good deaths, even Holocaust deaths, since the Jewish community collectively engages with them. It is only edict views from the outside who see these bad Jewish deaths as bad, since they don't engage in the collectivity. Can you comment on this individual and collectivity?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I don't want to. I imagine there are Christian images of collectives that could tell similar stories. This is also just a much broader Christian visual culture of an individual dead body, namely the body of Jesus Christ or various saints, that is kind of being built on, I think, in those Victorian images. And so maybe actually this is how I will answer this question, which is because Judaism lacks sort of an individual iconography of death that is present in other cultures, it's much easier to find that good Jewish death within community that has always sort of been one of the preeminent values of Judaism and one of the sort of emphases of Jewish ethics. Again, I still have this picture of the burial society up. That's an individual body being taken care of. So I don't want to say there couldn't be an individual body that tells a story of care, but it might be easier to find because we lack a sort of individual iconography to build off of.
Great. We have a question by Laura Liebman, who asks, are you looking at the little ceramic photos on gravestones? It seems that those could be on some level about good deaths, even though they aren't post-mortem, more like Yizkor books.
Yeah, exactly. I know about those. I haven't studied them in detail, but I think they would, for me, kind of be part of this visual culture of memory and memory of loved ones and the way we use photographs of living people to feel that we've fulfilled obligations to their memory. I think it's really fascinating that it would put on tombstones, and it doesn't seem to be a practice that exists today. And I should do more digging into their particular history. But I do think that they, again, kind of fall into a category about memory, instead of this sort of narrow band of sort of post-mortem images of dead bodies.
Sarah Lowe asks, when you showed the first example with the death picture of Ajod, you said he had been against reproduction of living people. At what point in Jewish culture was a photograph of living or dead seen as not in conflict with the second commandment?
Yeah, so there's a really long history and a lot of work that's been done on the second commandment in Judaism and how it's seen as limiting images of people or of anything in Judaism, and where that idea comes from. So there've always been images of people in Judaism. I haven't seen anything about like Jewish polemics against photography. I mean, you might be the expert, Professor Jelen. When photography was invented, in general, there is more visual culture and art of various types in Judaism than it's often given credit. But there were individuals, and Rabbi Alshod, as far as I understand, was a sort of very orthodox and very against sort of modern practices in the making of portraits, in the taking of photographs, were sort of part of a Jewish modernity that he was rejecting. But the author who I quote in that section, Richard Cohen, has a really great chapter about, in particular, rabbi portraits and how they became an important part of Jewish culture, starting in sort of the early modern period. So definitely by the time of Rabbi Ashod's life, there were rabbi portraits everywhere, and he was sort of unique in his ban of them. And you can see that from his students and the other rabbis at his funeral. Most people did not consider taking a photograph to be a problem. Just he did, which is why they went and did it anyways, apparently.
Yeah, it is a shocking story, isn't it?
It's always a winner.
It's so shocking. We have two more questions. So one is by Max Bamberger again. He asks, does this work offer insights on Jewish reactions to the image of Jesus on the cross that is central to Christian iconography?
I guess my question there is what's the word reaction doing? I mean, Jews definitely saw images of, Jesus on the cross in medieval Europe or wherever they lived among Christians. It was just sort of an everyday visual sight, just like it is for most American Jews today. They didn't believe in it. They, maybe looked down on it, but it wasn't unusual. I think there's a rejection somehow of a certain kind of visuality of death that was extant in Christian culture, perhaps, by not having images of the dead. Clearly, they developed a very different visual response to death, whether that's like an explicit rejection of Christian imagery or already in the Talmud, you have a lot of discussion of kind of having these simple funerals, not showing bodies. And so they might have just diverged for other reasons. But definitely Jews saw those images throughout history and just sort of lived with them.
And then finally, we go back to Elliot Dine, who asks a question that's related, I think, to the first question. My related question is that the photos of Jewish death you included, except for the last one from the New York Times, all seem to have Jewish bodies surrounded by groups of living people, while the Christian good deaths were all staged as the body by itself. This seems like it fits general stereotypes of these religions. Do you think that the differences in the photos just reflects your idiosyncratic photograph choices for this presentation? Or is there something there about Jewish views of death, memory, and or relationality?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's probably my idiosyncratic choice. There are definitely some of these Victorian death images where you will have family members in them. I chose one that I thought demonstrated what I was trying to say the best, and so it was a pretty clear photo. but there, I think, are some with families in them. I mean, there are definitely, photographs of big Christian funerals, or, people lining up to see, embalmed leaders. There are ways in which, as the COVID story is demonstrating, huge funerals for Haredi rabbis are a thing, and there's a real, again, emphasis on sort of a communal care for the dead. But I think that's also, extant in many ways in other traditions. And just to put something else in here, the little bit I know about Buddhist depictions of death, often those will be of the death of the Buddha surrounded by his followers, showing different kinds of mourning and reaction, but also the sort of calm acceptance that the Buddha taught. So definitely different cultures have different iconographic depictions that include different members of their individual stories. And just my last point would be, in terms of the really, the famous images of the death of Jesus, we can all think of an image of Jesus on the cross alone, but there's a whole set of paintings in the sort of story of the death of Jesus that show the care taken of his body by Mary and Mary Magdalene and other figures in that story that was really developed in the medieval period to show kind of the care taken for his body. And I think those are not dissimilar from maybe what are happening in some of the Prague Burial Society paintings as well. So definitely other communities have depictions of this kind of care and of groups mourning alongside the individual dead body.
Okay, well, we are out of time and we have exhausted our questions. So I want to thank you, Ranana, for this wonderful talk. So interesting, so enlightening. And I want to thank all of our attendees for coming out, as Ranana said, on a Tuesday evening towards the end of the semester. Really wonderful to have you all here, and thank you again.
Thank you. It was wonderful to get to speak with all of you.
Good night.